Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Susan Lynch. I am the Associate Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. I'm so pleased that you are joining us this afternoon. I want to thank UVA's School of Architecture for their partnership with today's program. Before we start, I want to bring a few things to your attention. We received many questions in advance of the program that have been shared with the speaker. If you have a question during the presentation, you may enter it in the webinar Q&A at the bottom of the screen. You'll find resources in the webinar chat box below. Please also note this program is being recorded and will be posted in the Lifetime Learning's podcast library in about a week or two. Now on to our speaker. We are fortunate to have Professor Bill Sherman with us this afternoon. Bill Sherman is the Mario di Valmarana Professor of Architecture and Director of Programs in Venice and the Veneto at the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia. As an architect and educator, Sherman examines dynamic cultural and environmental processes in architectural design, ranging in scale from human physiology to global energy flows. His work explores the intersection of these processes with the cultural frameworks that inform the design of buildings and cities, with a particular focus on emerging spaces for creative engagement and institutional transformation. As I mentioned, Professor Sherman is currently the Director of Programs in Venice and the Veneto, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary next year. So it's my understanding that some of the alumni of that program are registered for today's event, so I hope that many of you have been able to log on this afternoon. So with all that said, thank you so much for joining us. And Professor Sherman, I invite you to start your presentation.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to be here. It's really terrific to have an opportunity to hopefully transport everyone to Venice for about 45 minutes or an hour here, and be able to talk about several things about Venice. You could actually devote the entire semester and every credit that a student might take in that semester, which is in fact what we do, and we're in the middle of right now. But in 45 minutes, we'll touch on just a few issues. I like to describe Venice as a labyrinth within a labyrinth within a labyrinth, and it's both spatially and intellectually. So there is so much more than we can possibly talk about. But for this talk, we'll be focusing on Venice and its relationship to water. And I hope I address some of the questions that were posed in advance, but also look forward to answering any other questions that may come in after the talk today. In a way, as a starting point, I just wanted to explain a little bit about why the University of Virginia is so involved in Venice and why we've had programs for 50 years there. And we can really trace it back to one person, Mario di Valmarana, who joined the university in the early 1970s, an architect from Venice and Vicenza, and taught at the school and was one of the most beloved faculty members in the school for many years until his retirement in the early 2000s and unfortunately early death in 2010. He left behind an extraordinary legacy, both in the lives of the students who were able to participate in the program. Both of these photographs are from about 1994. I was much younger then and teaching with Mario then, about 30 years ago. And with the students, and he created an opportunity for students to not just visit and study the Veneto, but to actually understand the intimate bonds between the cultural life of a place, the environmental processes, the incredible history, and the life of a city and a larger territory that have had such a profound influence around the world and continue to be extraordinary places for us to study and to learn from. The program continues. This is a group that was in Venice last year. Monica Shanuda is an architectural historian who teaches with us there and leading the students on a tour in Venice. As I mentioned, it's a full semester of credits. They spend about 6 weeks of that in Venice, visiting and walking on tours. Here, for instance, learning from a craftsman who does traditional Venetian lime plaster techniques and teaching the students both about the material and about the techniques and how they do it, giving them an opportunity to try it themselves. The Valmarana family continues to be involved. Francesco de Valmarana, Mario's son here, with the students at the Villa Rotonda in Vicenza, the family home. The resident dog in the corner belonging to his cousin Nicolo, and be invited into their homes and visit the families. So it becomes more than just an academic engagement. It becomes a full immersion in every dimension of life in Venice, including things like learning how to row. And here a group of the students being taught by the oarswomen of Venice how to do the traditional stand-up rowing in the city. They learn how to draw. This drawing is actually by Charlie Menifee, who taught in the program a number of years ago and led our Vicenza program for many years. A beautiful image of Venice that he captured. And that tradition continues of hand drawing by the students and as a way of understanding. But they also are working with contemporary means to, for instance, imagine what would Venice look like if it flooded here in a collage that a student put together to picture Venice in, I don't know, 200, 300 years from now, if we don't do anything to address the challenges that we face, or to imagine at a kind of urban scale transformations of the lagoon that allow Venice to adapt and perhaps avoid that fate. At another scale, projects that looked at new edges for the city in the way that it met the water that would be both barriers and social spaces, create places for gathering along the fondamenta that line the lagoon and that are so full of life today, but whose uses are transforming, and the challenges of holding the water back perhaps lead to new design strategies. Or within Venice, addressing questions of housing crises in the city and coming up with designs for new neighborhoods that, in a way, learn from the structure of the city and envision new housing. We, throughout the program, invoke a mantra that I heard many times from Mario, which is all of the lessons of Venice, everything we're studying in Venice is not to learn how to reproduce it, but how these ideas can be portable and transformed to understand how they may be applied wherever we are, wherever we're practicing in the world. It's a program that straddles architecture and landscape architecture. It actually involves historians and planners as well. So it's one that engages students from all the disciplines of the School of Architecture, where planning students may take on large sites and understanding how they may become both, in this case, the cleaning up the toxins from a gasworks and turning it into a public park for the city. If you're fortunate to sit on the right side of the plane when you're landing in Venice, this is the view you get as you enter. And it is rather extraordinary, the compactness of it, what feels like the singularity of it. The Venice as this island, there's a black and white photo, but the island of red roofs floats, appearing to just float magically with just this one umbilical cord of the train bridge and the highway bridge connecting it to the city. And when one enters, as I mentioned, it feels like you've entered a labyrinth. You're into a space that is unlike any other city in the world, both in the nature of the architecture, the extraordinary transparency, the light, and of course, the fact that the streets are water. But it's also a working city. It's a city that has to find a way to take out the garbage, as in the image on the left. Here, one of the most spectacular views in Venice, looking across to the Church of San Giorgio Maggiore, across the Bacino, or the major heart of the lagoon in Venice. But it's also where the garbage is taken out, or the crews on the left who are delivering the products and all of the taking care of the kind of logistics that make the city run. Whoops. But it's also a city that celebrates its water, where one finds this is actually just a typical Sunday morning. of a group here, actually a group from Mestre, the adjacent city on the mainland, coming to row down the Grand Canal. Or one day a year when they close the Grand Canal to all boats except those which are powered by humans. And so you find everything from rowing shells to kayaks to traditional Venetian boats. People come from all over Europe to row down the Grand Canal as a spectacular moment, celebrating its life and its resources. It's also a city of contradictions and of global significance. Here, an installation connected to the Biennale in Venice, in the adjacent to the Arsenale, which is still a working military base. It, the in a way the most mundane dimensions of the city, the boats that are out doing the dredging and the maintenance at the same time that you have amazing installations here within the Arsenale, a project that was done in collaboration with a group from Lagos, Nigeria, which sits in a very similar geological condition. To build a floating schoolhouse with a group of architects from the architecture school in Venice. It's also a city that has an amazing public life. And here, and as we look at the mosaic of the islands, with the gaps that form what the Venetians call campos, which is a translation of field rather than piazza or plaza. It is become the hub of civic life and urban life for the neighborhoods that are in a way defined by islands, that the island, as one can see, an island of Santa Maria Formosa here with its main shopping street and its campo and its church, lined by the houses of the nobles who form the center, and back within it, the housing and the sort of commercial life. So in a sense, almost a village or a city within a village, and you see these start to get nested together in this amazing mosaic, connected by the waterways. The bridges came much later. Many of them, most of them were built in the 19th century. So until then, one traveled through Venice by water, not land. But the campos become a place for an incredible civic life, such as the markets in the Campo Santa Maria, Santa Margherita here, that run from the fish markets in the morning to the food markets throughout the day, or sites that we associate as potentially being tourist attractions. But here we are over in a corner of the city where this is not a tourist attraction. This is where this gentleman gets his produce every day for his meal. This is part of the life of the city for the residents, far from where the tourists form other crowds, coupled with perhaps the most elegant boulevard in the world of the Grand Canal, and an attitude toward life, which has found its way to deal with the uniqueness of its setting. One continues to, the restaurants stay open, you just put on the boots and you keep going when the water rises, and live with that. Couples getting their wedding photographs as the water rises here in front of the Doge's palace, or hanging out the laundry across the canals. It's a city of everyday life with everyday events. It's not a theme park, and that is part of our focus. In fact, it has some of the challenges that every major modern city has, of zones that industrialized in the early 20th century, both causing great pollution and in Venice's case, causing even more extreme consequences. But here, the juxtaposition of the oil refineries and chemical plants in the background with medieval fishing techniques in the foreground, somehow coexisting within the Venetian lagoon. Part of the premise of how I want to frame this is that Venice is not just that fish-shaped red island in the middle of the lagoon here, but it's actually a thriving metropolis. It's often referred to as a dying city and nobody lives there anymore. But if you actually back out the lens slightly, it's one of the most productive places in the world. The Veneto has an extraordinary quality of life. Venice is the heart, and like many cities, it's the historic core. What makes it distinct is the fact that it's separated and connected by the lagoon that, in a way, allows us to see Venice and think of it as something isolated, when in fact it really cannot be separated. For the last 1,000 years, it has been deeply connected, actually, both to the lagoon and to the landscape beyond. And if we look at that through a kind of metropolitan lens, rather than the singularity of the center of Venice, we actually see a very different kind of city. We see a city that is thriving. We see a city that is a global hub. We see a city that, unfortunately, as you can see from the dimensions of the industrial area to the left, is coping with all of the challenges that any modern city is coping with. So in a way, despite Venice's uniqueness, it is actually like most other successful, thriving cities in the world. It's just that these issues that Venice faces with respect to its relationship to water, with respect to its relationship to the environment, are all at the surface in a way that they're sometimes masked in other places. So it becomes an extraordinary place where the issues become visible, and where we really we can learn a tremendous amount through the study. That while we think of that umbilical cord as this singular tether that connects the city, it's really a much more complex and dynamic set of relationships. A number of years ago, I collaborated with former UVA faculty who's now at MIT and colleagues in Venice on a installation for the Venice Biennale that imagined a new map of the subway system, or not the subway system, it builds on the idea of other subway systems, but the Vaporetto system, which is the public transport system of a modified service, which is what they say when they have to change the routes for weather or special events. But we imagined an entirely new map that actually connected the city and the lagoon and the mainland. It's just a fragment of it in a completely different way than it's connected now, that started to break down this dichotomy of the mainland versus Venice and imagining it as a coupled city. The challenges that Venice faces come from many fronts. Many people, I'm sure many of you have heard about the battle over the cruise ships. And when you see a cruise ship coming through the canal, which one did up until 2019, it really, in a way, took the onset of the pandemic to finally ban the cruise ships. You saw such a radical shift in scale and a kind of the challenge that these ships faced, but actually many of the concerns were related to the numbers of people they would bring to the city. But there's a hidden danger of the scale of the disruption of the water and what it was actually doing to the foundations of the watery city that were actually finally what caused them to be banned. At the same time, you have climate change, you have sea level rise, you have the questions about Venice's future with respect to the sea, to what's happening globally, coming to bear in a very specific way. In this case, the Vaporetto that was washed ashore during the floods of 2019, a devastating flood that really brought to bear the degree of destruction that becomes possible. This photograph from the lagoon as a storm was passing, looking at Venice, really, to me, is emblematic of the issue that Venice faces. That's kind of line of inhabitation that you see across the middle of the photo is so thin. It's the way I often like to think about a description of even human habitation on the globe as being like living within the skin of the onion in relation to the globe. We're in this very thin layer where a few centimeters can make a difference in whether a place is habitable or not habitable. And the scale of the sea and the scale of the atmosphere are really pressing from both sides. And in a way, recalls something that goes back hundreds of years in Venice, which is the kind of posing of the city as this struggle between the land and the sea. that it is, there's a kind of opposition, and Venice exists in something of a kind of in-between space. This map, the so-called Barbary map of Venice, in a way also picks up on that theme, with Mercury, the god of trade, in the top, and Neptune, the god of the sea, in the middle of the bacino. Venice suspended in between. But an extraordinary view, this is done in 1500, an extraordinary view of the openness of Venice to the sea at the peak of its power as a kind of hub of commerce around the Mediterranean, that was unlike any other city in Europe at the time, which were almost all walled, which were almost all ruled by bloodlines of family, or had been founded or been ruled through conquest. Venice had at this point already been in existence for nearly 1,000 years as a republic, with an elected doge, with a kind of bicameral legislature that was the model that we built on in this country. It had found ways of building itself out of the lagoon as a extremely multicultural society, because nobody was from there. Everybody had arrived from somewhere else, because it was basically built on land that was otherwise uninhabitable. And so that connection to water not only gives rise to the form of the city, but a kind of ethic about a place that was be welcoming to everyone, because it belonged historically to no one. It's part of the founding myth of Venice. This image, I'm not going to dwell on the details, but it gives a sense of the fact that it was a trading partner with roots that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean, and the trade from the Middle East and Asia overland to the Eastern Mediterranean and into Venice, and because of its position up into Europe, always competing with Genoa, but also reaching out to some extent to the Western Mediterranean as well. In the early maps of Venice, this one I love because of the way it almost highlights the canals and the water as they run through, and the arrival in Venice, now perhaps a little more brightly lit than it would have been in 1500. This sense of incredible openness, this sense of a city just floating on the water, as a kind of magical apparition. If you imagine coming up the Adriatic and finding yourself in this with this kind of spectacle in front of you. And as you moved up the Grand Canal, the kind of transparency and openness of a kind you would never see in Florence, where every family house was a fortress against the families with whom it was battling for power. The political structure and the water as a defensive system allowed Venice to not have the walls and the defensive measures that every other city had at the time. So it but it was more, again, even from the beginning, just the island at the center. And here it begins to show a map. We see a map that includes the mainland, that includes the barrier islands, that includes all the other islands of the lagoon, each one having a purpose and a function. And we can see that the city would function by, its cemetery was on an island. It had hospitals on other islands. It had the lazaretti, which were the Nuovo and Vecchio that one can see on the map, which were the quarantine islands where people would stay for 40 days before they could enter the city during periods of the plagues. That it was a much larger urban system that gathered in the lagoon, and the lagoon was always central and part of it. Even here, Venice to one side, and this was always extraordinary to me, Murano in the center, where the glass factories were, moved out of the city so that they wouldn't burn the city down in case of a fire. But right next door, the agricultural island of Sant'Erasmo, which even today only has 600 people living on it, and is still producing the most amazing tomatoes that are pre-salted for you, that one can buy in the markets. It is a system that works together. So to talk about the water, to talk about the city, I will start with something about its geology very quickly. I'm going to run through this very, very rapidly here. But on a clear day from the Campanile of San Giorgio Maggiore, you can look across Venice and you can see the Dolomites, the sort of front range of the Dolomites across the entire landscape of the Veneto, and you realize how close this is. For those of us in Virginia, it is almost the same section that we have from the Blue Ridge down to Norfolk and Virginia Beach. But imagine it compressed to about a quarter of the distance and twice the height. That the Dolomites are a much younger mountain range than the Appalachians. It is, and this is the landscape that we were looking across, which is an incredible matrix of industry, of agriculture, of water, of a flow of sediments that you can see in the riverbeds coming down out of the mountains and forming the lagoon. This map by Paola Vigano, a faculty member at the University of Venice, who has actually taught at the University of Virginia a number of years ago, is an extraordinary remapping of that, highlighting all the water in red. And so you see that the water in Venice is completely connected to the water coming from the mountains coming into the lagoon. And of course, by definition, and well, actually, before I go into that, that's actually highlighted here in a children's exhibit up in the top of the mountains in the Plose, a ski area in the Dolomites that shows balls that run down that mimic the pattern of the water from the climate evaporation into the clouds coming down through the mountains and forming the lagoon in the city of Venice. A lagoon is, by definition, a place between land and sea that is where you have the salt water of the sea and you have the fresh water from the land coming together to create these brackish marshes, which are incredibly rich from an ecological point of view. And I love this map because it doesn't make absolutely clear what's ground, what's not ground, what's shallow water, what's salt marsh. And these salt marshes that are called the Barrena, which are kind of between land and sea, continue to this day to be part of our understanding of the lagoon. The other early maps, well, an early map and a more recent map, one looking at sediment flows more recently, and another drawn by the map maker Sabadino, who was the kind of commissioner of the works of the water, recognized from an early stage that the lagoon had to be managed, that it had to be, the fragility of a lagoon and their tendency to be transient urban forms means that it had to be orchestrated. Venice's origins are in the mud of the lagoon. The city was built out of these almost land. They were firmed up, and the kind of ecological processes, the systems that make up the lagoon were then coordinated and orchestrated to support the city. And the city can now not be separated from its lagoon. This is from We Are Here Venice, a group organized by Jane DeMosto, who we have met with in our programs in Venice, that talk about both the cultural and the ecological role of the lagoon in the life of Venice. In the early years of the lagoon, it was a different kind of inhabitation, houses on stilts. These images, which are not of Venice, but of the kinds of landscapes that Venice was at the time. And you can see in this view of these docks with these many small boats that there was an economy of how one inhabited the lagoon. Here, a painting by Carpaccio of a hunting party in Venice in the lagoon. This looking more like a aristocratic recreation, but it was also the source of the protein from the fish and the fowl of the lagoon that fed Venice. That continues today with the fishing structures in the northern part of the lagoon. You can see several of them in this image with the mountains in the background. But out of this landscape, the city is formed, and it took a kind of heroic act of construction and to make this possible. Two dimensions. First, we begin with the water. The quote at the top are saying Venice is in the water but doesn't have water. So they had to catch all their water. So the city was built around a system of cisterns that captured the water throughout the city and becomes the structure of the public spaces of Venice. These wells that have their wellheads all of the landscape of Venice would be contoured to drain and provide water. So as any treatise on architecture talks about, the first step is to found a city, and the first step in founding a city is to provide water. So in this brackish lagoon, they constructed, in a sense, these vessels for the water, and you can see them both in diagram and in fact here within a palazzo, but also they exist within the public spaces. But then you had to build the buildings, and the buildings required a kind of foundation that would be, in a way, similar to how others may have built over the years, but starting in very early, before 1000 AD in Venice, that you gathered the materials from around the region, from the stone from Istria across the Adriatic, the brick, the timber, the silica for the glass, all of that coming together, actually relatively few materials, but being assembled in this pattern to drive the trees into the ground to build a platform on which one could pile the stones. When you're underwater and there is no oxygen, the wood will last essentially forever. Venice is built on piles that are 1,000 years old and still completely intact. The Istrian stone, by the quirk of fate, is extremely waterproof, so that you could use it as the waterproofing on the outside of the structure. And you could build a layer of Istrian stone between the sea and the brick. You drive the piles in, sometimes by hand, sometimes by machines. There are millions of piles under the city, entire forests here in an excavation to see what they look like, an entire forest buried under the city. On top of that, you would build walls. There are actually very few singular points of columns because you had to spread the load of the building out over longer areas. So you built walls, and then you used wood to span between those structural walls and to build a palazzo. And this kind of form of building is everywhere in Venice, from the most modest house to the grandest palazzo. They all have the same structure. A student a number of years ago kind of mapped the structure in relation to the canals. They all run perpendicular to the canals so that it allows the buildings to be open at the ends to the streets or courtyards on the interior and the canals on the face. So that's how you could get the extraordinary transparency of the facades that you wouldn't see anywhere else. And then there was a hardening of the walls and a building of the edges of the city so that you could move from the land to the sea. You could unload goods at whatever level the tide was at. And then as you back out in scale, it had to protect the lagoon itself. As I mentioned, it's transient. So how do you hold back the sea and change the sediment flows on the land so that you could maintain Venice, the lagoon, as a defensive structure? Not all cities did that. Pisa used to be on a lagoon. Ravenna used to be on a lagoon. Their lagoons silted in over the centuries. Venice maintained its lagoon by diverting the rivers that brought the silt from the mountains and constructed canals in very coordinated efforts to bring the sediment around the lagoon. And then in a series of fortifications, and from the map below, you see many, many openings between the lagoon and the Adriatic, to a series of what are called murazzi, or extraordinary walls that separate the city from the Adriatic, so that the city has, in a way, controlled this landscape. But of course, things are changing. The water is rising. The challenges that once it gets above those layers of the Istrian stone and into the bricks are like sponges. They fill up with water. The stucco, that Venetian plaster, would then peel off. The salt would undermine the mortar, and in a way, Venice is completely threatened by this level of sea level rise that is not just Venice's problem. Here on the left, we show a map of Europe where the Netherlands is almost entirely under threat. Denmark, parts of London, parts of England, and of course Venice as these areas of concern. And the difference between how even the same tide, the kind of areas of the city that will flood, is quite extraordinary. This is a map that would take or a chart that would take too long to explore, but there are processes of subsidence, which is one diagonal line. There is human-induced subsidence, much of which happened through pumping the groundwater in those industrial sites, a practice that stopped in the 1970s, and that line has somewhat stabilized since then. The natural subsidence is just a compaction of the muck and the movement of geological plates. And then there's the rising of the water level, which is this line, and the frequency of higher tides, which compounds the problem to say that Venice is about 35 centimeters closer to sea level than it was historically. That's almost a foot. And the number of high tides are rising. This is actually today's tide chart. I did the slide on Monday. This was actually redrawn at a maximum of 105 centimeters among low water. And well, what does that mean? If we look at a map of Venice with the elevations here, if it's in red, it's around 110 centimeters or less. So these are the areas that would flood if the tide reached that height that I just showed. If we go, I'm zoomed in now on the Piazza San Marco, on the area right in front of the Basilica. This line is a new line of glass walls that have been put in place, but look at the elevations. It's 68 here at the entrance. It's 77 here. It doesn't take much for that to flood, and even the Google Earth image of the piazza was taken at a typical high tide when the water is coming back up through the storm drains and flooding the piazza. These two photographs, one on the right is the construction of that barrier to keep the water out of the basilica and from damaging the mosaic floors and the foundations any more than it already has. This is not rainwater in a puddle. This is the sea level of seawater just under the surface of the Piazza San Marco while it was being replaced last year. It does then rise just a little bit more, and the piazza fills. It's the lowest place in Venice, so it's the first to flood. But it makes its way back through the city. The Venetians have responded with sump pumps and gateways to keep the water out of the shop, or they just keep the stuff off the floor and they let the water through, and they just learn to live with this as a fact of life. Or the little bit of water comes up. This was last year on a mild high tide, and they just throw a board out so you can step over the water. There's a way of living. But the challenge is that it's getting worse, and it is causing structural damage, not just inconvenience. It's causing this kind of condition throughout the city that I just described, of the water getting up into the brick and moving through the buildings, crossing this threshold above the normal high tides and doing extraordinary damage. And so for the last 30 years, there have been projects and plans to protect Venice further from sea level. And many of you may have heard of the Mosè Barrier, which is a system that was envisioned and now built and operable. It opened in 2020. But look how different it is than what happened near London or in Belgium or in the Netherlands in these low-lying areas, which were these massive apparent engineering projects. This one was designed to disappear under the sea so that when it's not there, it looks just like it did for the last 1,000 years. When it's up, as in this photograph, this is about the only photograph I didn't take in this because they wouldn't let me get out here. But you can see the difference between the lagoon and the Adriatic in this image at two different water levels as the tide rose, and the barriers were inflated with air or filled with air, rose up out of the sea, and with its clever acronym of Mosè, parted the waters. It sits at each of the openings with even the construction of a new island at the main opening of Venice to the city. You can see that in this aerial photograph and its relationship to Venice here, but also at the main shipping channel at Malamocco and down near the city of Chioggia at the southern end of the lagoon. It is so the relationship of Venice now to the sea is one where, almost as in this image, the Adriatic is a kind of distant threat, but there is a means for controlling it for the near term. Part of the question for that is for how long? that it is no longer quite the lagoon of this Napoleonic survey in 1806. It is one that actually has to keep recalibrating. On our left is a landscape architect who studied at the University of Venice, now teaches in Trieste, Ludovico Centis, who has recently published a book. He's meeting here with the students and with Ali Fard, one of our faculty members, called The Lake of Venice, and makes both a radical proposition, but one that's incredibly anchored in the history of Venice and the long history of the manipulation of the lagoon to save the city and to make the city function, as well as research and plans from the 20th century of how to make the city even more of a thriving metropolitan area. How do you couple this with making it more of what it is rather than diminishing it? And his proposition is to, in a sense, make a lake in which Venice would sit in the central lagoon, and then in the other parts of the lagoon work on restoration projects to make them even function more fully as lagoons, but also as parks, as places that sit in relation to the city, as kind of central to both the ecological but also the recreational and the cultural life of the city. A whole range of propositions. The book is actually, I'm just touching on it here, but an extraordinary depth of study and research about how, and frankly, quite credible, but it required the kind of massive reconception that Venice did in the 12th and 13th centuries when it redirected the rivers. So there are propositions out there that are about both things in the works now, like the Mosè Barrier and a whole set of projects to restore the functions of the lagoon and restore the Barrena, to lift the edges of the city, to make it have stronger internal defenses against the sea level rise. But at a certain point, like any resilient system, it has to transform to survive at a certain point. And part of what he's trying to do here is to look forward and imagine a transformation that would allow Venice to, in a sense, be what it is, but to also be something new. And for that kind of thinking, that kind of transformational thinking, it requires new ways of seeing the city, looking at the city, but also new ways for us. It forms a model of a new way for us to think about all of our cities, because even if we're not here at this incredibly delicate threshold between land and sea, the kinds of issues we're facing are the same. And it requires that kind of transformational thinking in order to look forward, in order to think about our future in new ways. And that becomes the kind of lesson from Venice that is so apparent that we can take with us. It allows us to think regionally rather than simply in terms of a kind of locally in the way that we may solve a problem. But it also, in a way, expands our imagination so that one can think about how this kind of juxtaposition of an extraordinary church sitting in this thin line in relation to the water, how that kind of tension and how that kind of adjacency of a cultural life and an ecological life, a kind of ability for these to become mutually reinforcing processes that we engage in the life of the cities, that can be a model for how we think about how we live everywhere. So thank you, and I will welcome Susan back to lead us in questions. I know this was very quick. I left a lot out. I put a lot in that I could, but I'm happy to answer questions about any topic related to Venice and I will let you know if I don't know the answer.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Sherman. Such amazing photos and really did help transport me there, I'm sure, for the participants as well. Let's get our first question. Was somebody asked about how many, about the program itself, how many students and faculty are participating now in the program? And then do you have to be an architecture student to participate?
Both very good questions. We currently are running two programs, one during the school year with about approximately 15 students per year, and another in the summer that goes to Vicenza, which is a small city, the home of Palladio, the architect of that church we were just looking at, and of many villas in the Veneto, and intimately related to the history of Venice. We send about 25 students there. We have several faculty who lead, two faculty who lead that program. We have about two faculty plus faculty in Venice and others in the Venice program. But we are in the process of growing our footprint. And as part of that growing, we hope to be able to expand to include students. We did have a student from the College of Arts and Sciences last year. We hope to expand beyond the school. We are, as part of our 50th anniversary program, we are looking to build a more permanent footprint in the Veneto and in Venice that allows us to really engage the entire university in the long term.
Great, thank you. This is an interesting question that came in while you were speaking. He says, I live on Cape Cod, where hardworking tradespeople cross one of two bridges twice a workday because they cannot afford the relatively high cost of living. Does
Right.
this happen similarly in Venice, or has the city solved that problem in a different way?
That happens very much in Venice there, and it is part of the question. When you see statistics on Venice that it has dropped from a high 100 years ago, about 180,000 people, to now around 50,000 full-time residents in Venice. A lot of that migration has been from the historic core of Venice to the mainland, to Mestre, to the cities that line the lagoon. They're actually still part of the Comune, the city of Venice. But there are approximately 250,000 people on the mainland part of the city, and now about 50,000. So what you see is an incredible flux in the morning, very similar to what you find on Cape Cod and the islands, in many other parts where in a way, the core, the historic core, the city, the center that has a tourist life has been priced beyond the means of those who actually do the work, who live and run the stores, who build the places, come from. That happens in Venice, and that umbilical cord that we were looking at has massive numbers of people every day coming over by train and moving back, because, as you can imagine, it is relatively less expensive to live on the mainland. It leads to, in a way, some cultural challenges, because they may have different priorities. Those who live in the city don't want to simply be the kind of living in a theme park in the center of the lagoon while people are living a normal life around them. So it's a huge challenge that the city is really wrestling with on a daily basis.
Thank you. Several questions about the preservation of buildings. So
Mm.
how do they preserve their buildings and prevent mold with so much water? And how do they surveil the buildings underground and repair the structures? The question is that they would suggest that it would be very costly to do so.
Yes, it is. Maintaining the buildings in Venice is a costly enterprise. On the question of mold, historically, the key to that has been allowing the buildings to breathe. That mold is often a challenge when the air is trapped and is stagnant, and the mold can breathe within a closed environment. That's true in super sealed buildings that we build here or anywhere in the world. One of the interesting things about buildings in Venice historically is if water got in to the fabric of the building, the water could always move out. The lime plaster that was used historically in Venice is porous to water vapor, so the buildings could breathe. It's been a problem where people have replaced it with either mortars or plasters using Portland cement, which doesn't breathe, and then you're trapping the water in and mold can grow. That's a problem. The other way the Venetians have solved it is they don't live on the ground floor. The ground floor of buildings in Venice are almost never your residence. You live upstairs, and the ground floor is used for other things. And the traditional ca or palazzo, the ca is short for casa, that was the traditional Venetian house that I showed some diagrams of. That ground floor was the storeroom. It was the place of business. It was, and the dwellings were all upstairs. The in order to get underwater to do the kinds of repairs that may be necessary. Fortunately, most of what's under the water in Venice on the palazzos is actually very stable. The challenge is that the entire city has sunk, but the individual foundations, for the most part, even after 1,000 years, are in very good shape. When you do have to get there, you have to build a caisson, you have to keep the water out, you go down, and you don't want to expose that wood any longer than you have to if a repair has to be done. But the real challenge is due to the flooding, when you get the salt and the water up into the masonry and it wicks up into the building, and those salts start breaking down the mortar, and the moisture coming back out starts causing the plaster to spall. That is where the real challenge is, and it involves introducing new layers of waterproofing or figuring out ways to prevent the water from reaching, building kind of heavily plastered lower levels that are essentially building waterproof, almost like bathtubs in the buildings that keep the water from entering the wall in the first place.
So this question talks about this person recently read an article about how they drained and dredged the lagoons and canals in the 1950s. So I'm curious, she's curious if there's another huge undertaking like that that would need to be done. As you're saying, you need to balance that, I'm sure.
Well, the key to the balance, though, a lot of the dredging that was going on, especially in the 1950s, was related to the industrialization and creating waterways that actually were predictable for where boats could go. The key to Venice's history was that the local Venetians knew the waterways, they knew the shifting waterways. They didn't want to mark them because they didn't want invaders to come in. They wanted them to get marooned on in the shallow waters of the lagoon. But you don't want to do that with large tankers coming into the city. So they were creating new channels that would be permanent channels through the city, through the lagoon. And those did silt back up. It's actually a constant ongoing challenge of dredging. And they're actually constantly building new islands and dredging the lagoon even today because of that process. The ongoing challenge, or as we think to the future, there's a kind of ongoing maintenance dredging. That the real challenge now is almost the opposite. As the sea level rises, how do we actually keep from flooding all of the Barrena and losing those fragile ecosystems that are at that line between land and water? And how do we protect the buildings from the rising water? And so it is less of a dredging issue now and more of the nature of barriers and the nature of strategies. There has been discussion about if you're starting to have rising water, do you actually need to start letting more sediment back in so that you're maintaining that balance in the lagoon and it's not all buried underwater by the rise.
Interesting. This participant mentions that they live in Charleston, South Carolina, a city that faces many of the same issues as Venice. They're mentioning with over-tourism and flooding. And what resources should those in Charleston be looking at here to learn from Venetians, sort of nonprofits or research?
It's interesting. There actually have been some nonprofits that have sprung up that are looking at this kind of condition around the world. And if we look at, the area around Virginia Beach and Norfolk and Virginia, or we look at Charleston or Miami, the entire New Orleans and Louisiana coast, where so many population centers sit in relation to these low water levels in river deltas, in shifting waters, that in a way, consortium of lessons or a consortium of cities working together to pool their resources on these lessons. In a way, it's interesting to see the Dutch taking very heavy engineering solutions, which they've been doing from the beginning with the polders and with their land building exercises. We're actually starting this year's Venice program by spending 5 days in Amsterdam and Rotterdam before we go to Venice to see that approach. But in a way, the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of lessons, and understanding and in a way, some cities have an opportunity to perhaps take action now. The action really needs to be taken now. It took Venice 30 years to build its Moselle barrier. Not all places takes quite so long, but to take action now because they can anticipate the challenges by seeing what other cities have been doing. But as you saw in those images of the different floodgate barriers around the world, that are around Europe in that case, there are others that are happening in other Delta cities around the world, but around those European examples, it's really important to understand what's the level of threat and what's the appropriate response. And Charleston is wrestling with this in a way that has radically changed even in the last 20, 30 years.
Great. Several people have asked about the quality of the water for those that live there and for those that visit.
Well, the water that you drink is wonderful. It actually comes from an artesian well right next to the San Benedetto bottled water well. So when you drink tap water in Venice, you're drinking the same water that you would be buying in a bottle. It's fantastic, the water from the mountains. In terms of the lagoon water, it's still not safe to swim in. There have been two major forms of pollution, one coming from the industrial areas and one historically coming from the fact that the lagoon served as a sewer for the city. It is no longer that. Over the last 50 years, it's actually happened through a series of kind of decentralized sewage systems similar to internal septic tanks that have been built in the buildings, built into the foundations or into the basements, well, not really basements, but into the ground of buildings, ground floors of buildings to contain the waste and treat the waste before it's brought back into the lagoon. But historically, the city relied on the tides to, in a sense, flush the city twice a day. With the changes to the lagoon barrier to the Adriatic, it doesn't do that so effectively. So that water has been cleaned up. It remains an issue, and a lot of it now that they're facing is the residual toxins from the industrial sites along the edge of the lagoon. And just one last note, there were images of the incredibly clear water and even dolphins coming back into the lagoon and being visible in the lagoon during COVID. And a lot of that was due to the absence of boat traffic, which had been stirring up the bottom of the lagoon and causing just the action of the propellers churning up the sediment and turning the water very murky. So with the absence of boat traffic, the water cleared. And talking to residents who were living there during that time, it was extraordinary to see the lagoon in that condition.
Sure. And our last question, many people are planning trips, are asking, when is the best time to go to Venice? Anytime probably, but do you have an idea for folks of when is the best time to go?
I certainly have my preferences. I would encourage you to avoid summer if you can. If your calendar permits it. Summer is both hot and like any hot, humid environment. It's actually a climate that's very similar to Charlottesville or to Virginia. It gets hot in the summer and it gets cold, but not very cold for very long periods of time in the winter. Fall and spring are wonderful. The tourist season keeps extending. Maybe it's as the population ages and you get different groups of people at different times. It becomes very popular with European tourists in the fall. My favorite is the October-November time period. Into early December when it starts getting dark, and Venice is at a latitude similar to Montreal. In winter the days get very short and it becomes foggy and gray, and you really feel the kind of both the mystery and the quality of the city, not as you see it in the tourist images of the bright sunny Italian sun. So it's but spring is wonderful as well. Winter now has become the festival of Carnival has taken over and extended. It keeps getting longer and longer. But if you really, and so that is also an extraordinary time to be there for that. But to see the full range of life in the city without it necessarily feeling quite so full of tourists, I would encourage the fall and the spring.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Sherman, for all of this wonderful information. I'm sure that folks they haven't planned a trip yet, they will now. So we have shared in the link in the chat box. Professor Sherman has provided some restaurant recommendations, which folks had asked for, which is fabulous, and just some other information for folks to look at. So thank you so much, Professor Sherman, for your time and your expertise this afternoon. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, and I've enjoyed it.
So, and thank you to everybody for being here. I also want to thank the School of Architecture and Kim Wong Haggard for her partnership today. We hope you will join us for future lifetime learning programs. Please consider joining us on Saturday, October 5th from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. for a More Than the Score program entitled Disruption or Evolution, the Future of Electric Vehicles and the U.S. Auto Industry. The speaker is Michael Lennox, the university professor and the Taylor Murphy Professor of Business Administration at the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia. If you live here in Charlottesville area, you can join us in person or log in online for a live stream. To register for these programs and find out about other programming, visit our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. When you get to our website, you can check out our future lifetime learning programs, the podcast library, our Thoughts from the Lawn blogs, and our UVA Speaks podcast series to read, watch, and listen to our expert UVA faculty. So thank you again so much for joining us for this hour of learning, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening.